Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Jewish Policy Center webinar with guest Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. As many of you know, and there are many of you on the phone today, JPC was founded in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of foreign and domestic policy by scholars, academics, and commentators. We support a strong American defense capability, close U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny those things. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. That last one has become a lot more important to us in the last couple of months. We have brought you some outstanding speakers: Richard Goldberg on Iran sanctions, award-winning journalist Claudia Rosette on the Hong Kong uprising and its sad demise, Daniel Blumenthal, one of the great China hands in the United States, on China's initial reaction to the Wuhan virus and its ongoing priorities. Excuse me. Brigadier General Asaf Orion on the U.S.-Israel security relationship and the way relations between Israel and China are changing over time. Scholar of Islam Harold Rode on Turkey's determination to enhance the Islamification of Jerusalem. Ilya Shapiro, Doug Feith, Michael Duran, Arsen Ostrovsky, Max Abrams, and more. I am thrilled today to introduce our guest, Jonathan Schanzer, to talk about Saudi Arabia's relationship to the Biden administration. Jonathan is Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's also on the leadership team of FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power. Economic and financial power sounds a lot like Saudi Arabia, so this should be really good. He previously worked in terrorism as a terrorism finance analyst at the Department of the Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He's held think tank research positions at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and Middle East Forum. And he sat in my chair, not my personal chair in my personal office, but he sat in my chair at the Jewish Policy Center. And I hope, John, I'm living up to the standard that you set. You can tell me about it later off screen. He has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, along with more than a dozen monographs and chapters in edited volumes. His 3 books have made unique contributions to the field. State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State, argues that the main roadblock to Palestinian statehood is the Palestinian Authority itself. Political dysfunction and mismanagement. I think we know that. I think the book, though, goes to a wider audience, and it's really an important book for people to understand as they try to make sense out of Palestinians, Israel, struggle for peace, all those things. Really important book. His second book was Hamas versus Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine. It's still, I think, the only book on the market that analyzes the ongoing Palestinian civil war. And I don't think most people know there is an ongoing Palestinian war. And there is also Al-Qaeda's armies, Middle East affiliate groups, and the next generation of terror. He testifies before Congress, publishes widely in the American and international media, and he has appeared on every news media outlet that you would expect, from Fox and CNN to Arabic language channels. He has traveled the world. In fact, he used to travel through the Middle East, through the Arab countries, when it wasn't a kind of normative thing to do before the Abraham Accords. He was in Yemen, he was in Bahrain, he was all across the region, and he brings a huge, huge wealth of knowledge to us. His PhD is from King's College in London, where he wrote his dissertation on the U.S. Congress and its efforts to combat terrorism in the 20th century. Maybe he'll tell us how we're doing. Today, he's going to talk about the political dynamic between Saudi Arabia and the United States. We've spent the last several months in a kind of cocoon, basking in the Abraham Accords, thinking that everything was going down the right path, feeling like Saudi Arabia may not have signed on the dotted line, but surely it was, not disapproving of the Abraham Accords. So I think we missed something. We missed the Biden administration, which appears to have a different view. Before I turn the floor over to Jonathan, let me just remind you, questions We will take questions during the program on the Q&A function on your Zoom. I will be monitoring. And now, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shoshana, and you are doing a terrific job sitting in my old chair, not your actual chair right now, but that position, and it was a special one for the couple of years that I was there, and I continue to watch the JPC grow and prosper, and it's a point of pride for me. I want to thank you for having me today and giving me an opportunity to talk about this. This is something that I've gone on television in recent days talking about, and I plan to do more writing about. And so in preparation for today's conversation, it's really helped me kind of organize some of my thinking, and I'm really actually eager to hear your questions, and that may actually help prompt some more thinking as well as I continue to write and address this issue. So we'll start by just what happened just a few short days ago, the release of the report by the U.S. government with regard to the Jamal Khashoggi murder. And let's be very clear, it was a brutal murder. It was carried out by the Saudi government with the full knowledge of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. It was done at the consulate in Istanbul in Turkey. It was done in a premeditated fashion. A lot of the things that the Saudis said initially have not borne out to be true. It was clear again that this was premeditated murder, and we should condemn it. There's no question about it. And I'll just be unequivocal now up front as we set the table for today's conversation. Now, that all said, we should be looking at what happened after the release of that report, what the intention of the U.S. government was, and perhaps also some of the other steps that the U.S. government has taken since the Biden administration took power in January. It does not add up to me. Just first of all, I would just say that the release of a report like this is not something that we see very often. When it comes to allies, if it is a report on, Chinese genocide in Xinjiang, sure, this is exactly the sort of thing that we would expect. Or the Navalny, poisoning out of Russia, another thing that we would expect, because this is a country that is seen as an adversary, or in fact, even an enemy of the United States. To issue a report like this about an ally is, I think, sui generis. I've never seen anything quite like it before, certainly in Middle East foreign policy. And it also comes amidst two other significant moves that were made by the Biden administration very early on. The first was a decision to cut support to the Saudi-led military operations in Yemen to counter the Iran-backed Houthi movement that has been carrying out terrorism and exacerbating the conflict. In fact, really heaping on the pain and suffering in Yemen to the point that the country is really on the verge of famine. And the Saudis have been doing, I don't want to say they've been doing a good job in terms of countering the Houthis, because their military operations have been something of a disaster, but they're the only ones doing it. And they were, in fact, leading from behind, or helping the United States lead from behind, and consistent in a way that is consistent, I think, with longstanding Democrat and even to a certain extent Republican foreign policy. We also saw very early on in the Biden administration the decision to delist the Houthi terrorist organization, otherwise known as Ansar Allah. Now, of course, the listing of the Houthis took place really in the last hours of the Trump administration. I think it was a mistake by the Trump administration to wait that long to add them to the list of foreign terrorist organizations, but I think it was an equally terrible mistake to delist them so early on in the Biden administration. Really, it voided out whatever leverage we had with the Houthis. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But basically, we have three options in terms of dealing with the Houthis. One is the military option, which again, the Biden administration took off the table. Then we took away the economic statecraft component of this, the ability to engage in sanctions against the Houthis. So the only thing we have left right now is diplomacy. And so we have Tim Lenderking right now in the region asking the Houthis to please come to the table and please cooperate with us. And the Houthis, with encouragement from their Iranian paymasters, are saying, no, thanks. and they are continuing to engage in a range of terrorist activities, suicide drones, ballistic missiles, targeting oil facilities and the like, and we have no leverage. Diplomacy is not leverage. Diplomacy is what happens after you use your leverage, and so we now find ourselves in a very difficult situation there. But the thing that really I think troubles me right now when I look at this kind of 1, 2, 3 punch, if we can call it that, these 3 moves that the United States has made with regard to Saudi Arabia, or at least having a direct impact on Saudi Arabia, is that I see no strategic value in what we have done. The alienation of Saudi Arabia is complete. There is no doubt about that. We have angered the Saudis. We have made it clear that we really don't value the alliance that we have with the Saudis. And it is now clear that the Saudis are unhappy. They are, I think, reassessing. There's been a flurry of diplomatic activity in Saudi Arabia over the last couple of days. But the one thing that was missing really out of that Khashoggi report is the now what component of this. We didn't see sort of what would happen next. Now that we name and shame MBS, now that we call out the Saudis for this crime that took place, by the way, 2 years ago. So I think the immediate impact of reporting on this, of course, the Trump administration shielded the Saudis, but to do this 2 years later without a clear strategic aim strikes me as something that is very odd. And I think that it was done more as a knee-jerk reaction, perhaps in response to pressure coming from the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. But I fail to see how this benefits America long-term. So there are questions about what comes next. And in particular, let's just talk about the leadership component of this for a minute. This report made it very, very difficult for Mohammed bin Salman to save face. Now, he shouldn't be able to walk away from his involvement in this murder, but let us not forget that this is the man who is going to be the next king of Saudi Arabia. It will happen sometime soon. We don't know exactly when, but we do know that King Salman is aging and he is infirm. He is not well. And so there is a clear line of succession. Mohammed bin Salman will claim the throne, and then we will have, another 4, perhaps 8 years of the Saudi leadership being at loggerheads with the Biden administration. And it's unclear how we are going to be able to come back from that. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end, about the kind of bureaucracy that Saudi Arabia has. But we, I think, are going to see strained ties at a political level. And that is, I think, the future. That's what the future holds for the U.S. Saudi relationship for the foreseeable future. But let me go a little bit deeper and look at some of the portfolios where Saudi Arabia has a lot of influence, because I think, when we think about the now what component of this, I think that the Biden administration maybe ignored or gave short shrift to the things that really matter to the United States, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. The first, I think, as Shoshana mentioned, is the issue of the Abraham Accords. The decision of the United Arab Emirates to normalize with Israel, the decision by Bahrain to normalize with Israel, and then subsequently Sudan and Morocco, these would not have happened without Saudi acquiescence. Let me just be clear. These countries are all within the Saudi sphere of influence. The Saudis are the sun, and the rest of these guys are the other planets. And the Saudis have decided to allow their smaller partners, lesser partners, junior partners, whatever you want to call them, they have allowed them to do this. They've done it at Saudi's urging, as Saudi Arabia has gone through a transformation in thinking about its own foreign policy, and to a certain extent, even its domestic policy, they have encouraged these countries to step forward and to do basically what the Saudis have been doing behind the scenes all along, which is cooperating with Israel on military and intelligence and technology, agriculture, economy. All of these things have been happening behind the scenes. So what the Saudis have done is they've allowed first the Emiratis and the Bahrainis to step forward and to really test the market, right? To dip a toe in the water, to find out what the reaction would be from the United States, what the reaction would be from Iran, what the reaction would be from the Arab world, and probably most importantly, what the reaction would be from their own domestic constituents, if you can call them that in these monarchies. but the idea would be to find out, for the Saudis to find out whether there would be any significant backlash. Having seen none, the Saudis moved more pawns into the center of the board. They moved Morocco and Sudan. Again, not at great cost to them, but important for the world to see that this is happening. And ultimately, the goal, I think, for Saudi Arabia was after enough Sunni countries had made this move in this direction of normalizing with Israel, it would make it far less risky for Saudi Arabia to do the same. I think it's now safe to say that the Saudis don't know if they can do that any longer because they're not getting the encouragement that they expected from the United States. In fact, the U.S. has put a halt on the F-35 sale. They've reimposed aluminum tariffs on the UAE. They are, to a certain extent, the Biden administration looks to be dissuading these countries from moving forward to some extent or another. And that, of course, is not lost on Saudi Arabia. So I think we have an Abraham Accords construct that may be in jeopardy. It's not 100% in jeopardy, but there is a risk now that the Saudis may take a step back from this risk-taking because, to be clear, they were doing this in part because it was in their interest, but also in part because they were looking to the Trump administration to basically recreate a new security environment in the Gulf to counter Iran primarily, but also maybe the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, and other jihadi groups. And now they're not sure that they're getting that encouragement any longer. Another security construct to look at is the Eastern Med. Now, this is a construct that is probably not getting a lot of attention right now, but it is something for all of us to watch. The Eastern Med is largely a gas and energy construct. This is basically the future of Israel's economic windfall. This is where it will all happen through the gas finds that they have and the gas finds that they're going to share with the likes of Egypt and others in that region. But we now have an interesting alliance that has taken shape there with the Greeks, the Cypriots, the Egyptians, and also with the backing of the Gulf states to counter Turkey and its aggression, and also to try to mitigate the conflict that we have seen ongoing in Libya. And it is this construct would not have happened, again, without Saudi acquiescence, without the Saudis encouraging some of this. You have to remember that the Gulf states have been supporting Egypt after the Sisi counter-revolution and the economic downturn that the Egyptians have experienced. The Gulf states have tried to prop up the Sisi regime, and they've done so somewhat successfully. They look at the rest of this region as an important way to counter Turkey's malign activity. And that's a fairly broad range of activity that we're looking at. I think first and foremost is the illegal drilling off of the coast of Cyprus and their exclusive economic zone. But also don't forget that the Turks have been trying to unseat Sisi in Egypt. They have been sponsoring terrorist groups in Libya, and they have been running guns and weapons. They also have continued to challenge Israel in many significant ways and try to gain an upper hand with Israel's Arab population. And so the Saudis have played a role in trying to counter the Turks there as well. And it's unclear whether of course, they've done so with the full cooperation of the Trump administration and to a certain extent with the EU. It's unclear now whether this is going to be able to continue, whether they're going to feel that they have a green light to continue to try to influence this increasingly important region. And again, I think it's one that I think we should all watch. Now, there's another important portfolio that I think the Biden administration has ignored as well, and that is this sort of broader question of reform in Saudi Arabia. We're probably all aware of what is known as Vision 2030. This was a vision set forth by the Crown Prince to transform Saudi society, to take it out of the rentier oil state model and into one that would actually produce industry at home unrelated to energy, that would ultimately turn the Saudi population into taxpayers and responsible stakeholders. So kind of pivoting away from the traditional monarchy model that we have long heard about. And so this has amounted to curbing Wahhabism. We have seen a marked downturn in the radicalization that we saw, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and all the crisis that we saw back then. And by the way, I would just note here that had we taken the kinds of moves that we've recently seen by the Biden administration, had we taken those moves after 9/11, I would have been nodding my head in violent agreement. I would have said that it was the right thing to do, given that the fact that the Saudis had acted like enemies of the United States, and they had sponsored organizations like Al Qaeda and other jihadist groups. We are not there now. Vision 2030 has shown that the Saudis are moving, albeit slowly, in a different direction. They see the perils of supporting these radical extremists, and they're looking to curb them. We have seen this, I think, markedly with the Muslim World League. This is an organization that I don't particularly love, even today. But we can say that Mohammed al-Isa, the head of the Muslim World League, who I met a few years ago on one of my trips to Saudi Arabia, he has been engaging in Holocaust re-education across the Middle East, teaching the Arab world that the Holocaust did in fact happen, and that the Arabs need to be sensitive to this, and that they should be working to address this black mark on history. And of course, the Arabs themselves, particularly the Palestinians, but others as well, maybe didn't look dimly upon Hitler and his exterminationist project, because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at the time. And that has really led to Holocaust denial across the board, really across the entire Arab world, including from the likes of Mahmoud Abbas and his PhD. So we're looking at that. Now, the other things, I'll try to fast forward here, but the Saudis have immense influence in two very important countries in East Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia. These are two countries that have significant importance to the United States. The Saudis have long been patrons and important political partners for these countries. They could go the wrong way if the Saudis decide that they are no longer trying to uphold American interests in retribution for what we have just seen coming out of Washington. Red Sea security. There's a huge amount of trade that goes through that corridor into Europe. A huge amount of food and oil will travel through there. Also a huge amount of internet traffic. And the Saudis have been the purveyors of security in this crucial region. And we could see the Saudis turn away from that, or at least you signal to the United States that it's someone else's problem. Iraq stability. The Saudis have played a quiet role there. It has been a mess, of course, ever since the rise of ISIS, and actually since then the rise of some of these Shiite militias that Iran has control over. But the Saudis have played an important role in pushing back against a lot of these activities. And it's, again, unclear whether the Saudis will continue to want to do this after what the U.S. has done in terms of snubbing the Saudis. There is, getting back to Yemen and the Houthis, let me just say this, that the Houthi problem is a nasty one. There has been a civil war going on there really since the early days after the Arab Spring. Yemen was never a stable country in the first place, and it was never going to be a success story, no matter how the whole thing turned out, because of the poverty, because of the lack of resources, and all the other problems. For anyone who's ever looked at Yemen, this is not a lovely place to be. But what we can say is that if gone unchecked, the Houthis could do a lot more damage. They have created, in large part, almost single-handedly, the famine that has spread across Yemen. A lot of people are going to blame the Saudis for their errant bombing campaign. And for sure, the Saudis have contributed to the suffering there. But you have an Iran-backed terrorist organization that continues to gain territory and continues to terrorize the people. And for some reason, the Biden administration has decided not to look at the Houthi responsibility, but really to put the onus on the Saudis. What's a little strange, though, is that after the delisting of the Houthis, we've seen statements coming out of the State Department saying that the Houthis must do more, the Houthis must curb certain activities. Of course, we have very little leverage, as I mentioned, leading the Saudis to scratch their heads wondering, what are we going to do about it? But in the meantime, I will just say this about Yemen. The Houthis are using weaponry right now in Yemen. This is a proving ground, a testing ground for Iran. They are using suicide drones. They are testing ballistic missiles. They are testing precision-guided munitions. These are weapons that we are going to see on Israel's borders. We are going to see them potentially in Hamas's hands. We'll see them in Syria. We'll see them in Iraq. This is what Iran is doing right now. And so this is why it is so important for us. It is a national security imperative. And the idea that we don't want the Saudis to be fighting this or to be trying to curb it or to interdict these weapons or to destroy them, to me, this seems like it's shooting ourselves in the foot, if not in the head. And so I do think that Yemen needs to become a greater priority. And again, I think when the Saudis scratch their heads and wonder exactly what happened here, they're very justified in asking that, because they are doing the bulk of the heavy lifting right now in this conflict. Now, there's a couple of other things that I would just note here. There is a question of whether the Saudis might pivot to Iran, that after years of fighting Iran, they may just say, well, look, if the U.S. is so determined to engage with Iran and help Iran and give them sanctions relief and engage in nuclear diplomacy, well, then, you know what, if you can't beat them, join them. I don't think that's likely, given the longstanding enmity that exists between Shiites and Sunnis in the region. But, perhaps the Saudis might just give up on this longstanding effort to curb Iran's ambitions and could potentially just decide, hey, if the Iranians are probably on a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon, maybe we'll just do the same and just throw our hands in the air and basically have a standoff with the Iranians, a nuclear standoff along the lines of what we see between India and Pakistan. Let me just say, Saudi Arabia and Iran are not India and Pakistan. It's actually a worse scenario in my view, and it makes me very nervous to think that this could be something that we see moving forward. I mentioned a little bit about the reform. I'll also just say that the Saudis have engaged in women's rights reforms that I think are very positive, that could impact the rest of the region, whether it's the Taliban or other countries around the world. For those of us that care about women's rights, this is something that, if the Saudis turned away from these efforts, I would be very concerned there. And then last but not least, I'll just say, all of this just happened amidst the rise of a new great power competition, that the United States is now engaging in a great power competition with China. And the idea that we are going to give up on this sort of quiet transformational approach with Saudi Arabia, which has been our policy for years, even after 9/11, even when someone like me would have said, let's just jettison the entire U.S. Saudi relationship. We have seen Republicans and Democrats alike quietly try to cultivate the change that has in fact happened in Saudi Arabia. Again, I'm not going to dismiss what happened with Khashoggi, but that is not the sort of sum of every action that the Saudis have taken. There's been a lot of positive developments that have taken place there. That transformational approach that we've taken has been a good one. What we have just told the Saudis is that we don't care about the transformations that have taken place in their society, that all the good things that have happened, you know what, doesn't matter. You are responsible for some errant bombing in Yemen. And on top of that, you killed a dissident and an American journalist in Turkey, and therefore we are torching the relationship. So what we're basically saying is we're back to kind of where we were before, where maybe it was a bit more transactional in nature. Certainly the Saudis are going to see it that way. They're going to say to themselves, you know what, maybe right now it might make more sense for us to go to China, where they don't care what we do about anything. Because this is the way that China engages with every country around the world. It is 100% transactional in nature. And so the Saudis might say, you know what, Chinese aren't going to punish us. They're not going to issue reports. They're not going to tell us what we should or shouldn't do with our own dissidents. Maybe we'll just go there. And by the way, we know they're hungry for oil. So what? Let's just do this. And what we might have just done is we might have just jettisoned the entire kind of energy relationship that we've had with Saudi Arabia, not to mention the fact that the Saudis are the de facto leaders of the Muslim and Arab world. We may have just, at the very beginning of this great power competition, we may have just ceded the Gulf. And that, I would say, is probably the greatest strategic blunder that I could imagine this early on in the Biden administration. And that's why I've been calling this diplomatic arson. That really is what it looks like. We just torched a relationship that we spent years developing and that had strategic value for us. And I cannot see why we would have done it. Now, one last note, and that is that, under the Obama administration, we saw a lot of strain with the Saudis, but the Saudis did not really respond in a open way. they kind of stood behind the Israelis, and it was Bibi Netanyahu that came out and spoke before a joint session of Congress opposing the Iran nuclear deal. And the tensions between Israel and the United States really grew and festered. But what we continue to hear about during that time was that the relationship was still on solid ground because of the professional relationship that existed in the bureaucracy, deep into the State Department, deep into the Pentagon, and even at lower levels at the NSC and beyond. And certainly in Congress, people-to-people relationships, law enforcement exchanges, all of those things that we all know have basically put the U.S.-Israel relationship on solid footing, no matter who is president, whether Democrat, Republican, pro-Israel, anti-Israel, somewhere in between, it doesn't matter. My concern right now is that Saudis do not have that depth in their bureaucracy. They do not have the kind of depth that Israel has. And so if the relationship really rests on top senior people, and those senior relationships are unraveling in the aftermath of these decisions that have been made by the Biden administration, then we may be in for a very, very rough ride indeed. I do think that the Israelis can potentially help now that we have the Abraham Accords structure. But again, it's unclear whether the Saudis are going to want to continue down that path. Certainly, it's not clear whether they're going to want to normalize with Israel. They may decide that they need to go in a different direction after all of this. So again, I think in short, it's very, very curious as to why they did this. It feels like a very politically motivated decision. It seems somewhat knee-jerk. It looks like an attempt to sort of feed the progressive wing of the party, but without any real strategic advantages. I fail to see how this redounds to America's advantage, short-term, medium-term, or long-term. And it's for that reason, again, that I would call this diplomatic arson. Let's hope that we see some changes, but I'm not optimistic now. And I guess we'll just have to hold on and see. So I tried to do this within a half hour. It looks like I did okay. Shoshana, back to you.
You did fine. You've left me a little bit breathless. We have questions. So you mentioned that this appears to have been done without a lot of strategic thinking on the part of the Biden administration. Maybe we can put together some points here, says a questioner. Biden has canceled the Keystone pipeline. At the same time, he aggravates the Saudis. And at the same time, the Palestinian Authority has decided that the UAE cannot join the Eastern Mediterranean Oil and Gas Consortium, which the fact that the Palestinian Authority has veto power here is a little bit weird anyway. Is this going to affect oil prices in a way that perhaps some people in the administration would like? If you drive up the price of oil, people will go on to other things. We know that doesn't really happen. We just pay higher oil prices and it wrecks the economy. Is it possible that there is a motive back there?
Look, it's possible. And by the way, I would also add that kind of giving a green light to the Houthis to continue to carry out terrorist attacks. I mean, this has had an immediate impact on the oil market. But I would also just note this, that not only would it potentially drive people to, clean energy, although I can talk about how clean energy is not exactly clean, especially with the issue of rare earth minerals and the environmental impact that the mining and refining, at least reportedly, has. But also don't forget that, for Iran, it's a windfall for them. That oil is still their number one export, even as there have been sanctions placed and restrictions placed. It's in Iran's interest to see oil prices go up. And so that's maybe a short-term benefit. As we've seen already, the Biden administration appears to have unlocked $3 billion worth of funds that were held in foreign banks. This could be yet another perk to the Iranians. Look, all of this is conjecture right now, but certainly I think it's worth watching as these events unfold.
By the way, on that point, the South Koreans say they have not released funds. Do you have any insight into whether they did or didn't release?
I can't confirm. Obviously, only the South Koreans will be able to tell you this, but it was also happening amidst negotiations about a vessel that was being held by the Iranians, sort of hostage diplomacy. So that's obviously one to watch. I think there was an Omani bank and I think maybe an Iraqi bank as well, if memory serves. So these are all banks that I think, and by the way, the Omanis and the Iraqis are only too happy to work with the United States, as we've seen in the past. Both governments are somewhat pro-Iran in nature. So I think it's very reasonable to assume that this might happen if it hasn't happened already. Interestingly, Tony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, said that he would not be giving any perks to Iran to try to bring them back to the table. I'm not sure that's true, especially if these funds are released. Obviously, we're looking for confirmation, but certainly that looks like an inducement to the Iranians to begin to negotiate anew.
So that raises another question from a listener. You had written early on in the Biden administration that you thought that there would be more continuity than discontinuity on things like the Abraham Accords or Israel security or human rights policies or whatever. Second thoughts?
Yes and no. One of the things that we're doing right now at FDD is we're actually going to start tracking the Biden administration's foreign policies on a range of issues. From military deployment to Turkey to Israel to Iran to China, and it's a mixed bag. It really is. In some cases, there is a clear effort to continue Trump administration's policies. In some cases, positive steps away from Trump administration policies. I think Turkey, for example, could be one of them. That the Trump administration was somewhat willing to work with the Erdogan government when maybe it shouldn't have been. So overall, I would say that we are seeing a sort of neutral posture as it relates to Trump administration versus Biden administration foreign policy. The biggest alarm that I have right now, the most alarm that I would say relates to the Iran nuclear negotiations, without question. And I think we always knew that there would not be a lot of continuity there. I am concerned about how long it took the Biden team to reach out to Bibi and to facilitate that phone call with the Prime Minister of Israel. That I don't think is a good sign. But look, I think that when it comes to various terrorist organizations, to China, to Taiwan, to Korea, on a range of foreign policy issues, they seem fine. It's just, it happens to be that, at least for me, for my organization, and probably for most of people on the call, we're seeing some alarming developments with regards to Iran, and specifically Iran and Israel, Iran and the Gulf. So these are the ones that we're going to have to watch and make sure that our voices are heard.
Okay. Question on Khashoggi, who was, by the way, a U.S. permit holder. He was not an American. He was not a permanent resident. And I just want to be clear, because you made the point that we don't normally excoriate other countries, friendly countries, for those things. And one of the excuses has been, well, he was an American. No, actually, he wasn't. It doesn't change the horrible factor of his death, but as a point. Question, though, is it, first of all, what would be an appropriate way to say to Saudi Arabia, what you did was an unacceptable thing? And second, is it reasonable to compare what happened to Alexei Navalny in Russia with what happened to Khashoggi and the U.S. response? There was no U.S. response, essentially, to Navalny.
Correct. And I would say that I would have probably swapped the responses, right? I mean, where you potentially issue new designations, and target those responsible without issuing a full-blown report on a U.S. ally or U.S. friend, which is what happened here. I think there are a range of responses that the U.S. can deploy in such situations, and I think they went, they're sort of from 1 to 10, and I think with Saudi they went to 11. If I can invoke the movie Spinal Tap, they went above and beyond. It was really, it really, I mean, short of just designating MBS himself, which they didn't do. They really took the volume up rather quickly. I think that there could, by the way, I also would say that making the move that they did this early on made very little sense because they don't have a baseline of understanding with the current Saudi government. They've not been in touch. They haven't been working with them. Had they done this 6 months later, they could have coordinated the rollout of this report. They could have made it clear to the Saudis, look, this is going to happen. We want you to prepare for this. We can discuss how we're going to do this. Maybe you might push back on a few things here and there, and they could have worked out some kind of, I don't want to call it compromise, but they could have softened some of the edges so that the relationship could have been maintained. Again, I don't want to suggest here that the Saudis are a terrific ally or that they're wonderful to work with. I remember, working for Daniel Pipes years ago. He called them a mafia family with a seat at the UN, and that may be quite true. But they still have, for all the reasons that I discussed today, they have value to the United States strategically, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and we appear to have just thrown that out the window. Now with Russia, we have, I think, far fewer interests, right? We see them very clearly as adversaries, if not enemies. They have tried to tamper with our democratic process. They have, that they've made mischief, or more than that, in Ukraine, Crimea, Eastern Europe. They threaten our European allies. These are the sorts of things where a report like that would damage Russian credibility would be very, very useful, and in fact would be engaging in what I would call gray zone warfare, right? Where, or diplomatic warfare. This is where we should be doing this with the Russians. And by the way, we should be doing more of this with the Chinese as it relates to Xinjiang or the coronavirus and its origins. These are the sorts of reports that we should be putting out because they'll do damage to our enemies, not to our allies. Imperfect as these allies may be, they're still allies. And I think we've forgotten the difference between allies and adversaries so far in the Biden administration, at least as it relates to the Middle East.
Which is frightening. There's a three-part question here from listeners. We tend to think of the region as the Persian Gulf, and you have Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on the other side, and you have the UAE and those countries, and that's where the kind of Abraham Accords security concerns came from Iran being here and Saudi Arabia being here. But the Houthis are in fact on the Red Sea, and the Red Sea is important to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to Jordan. Those are all allies of ours. Does the Biden administration appear to have a Red Sea strategy? Number one. Number two, doesn't the United States have a military base in Djibouti on the Red Sea, and shouldn't that be of major concern? And number three, apparently a colleague of ours yesterday in a webinar expressed a concern that the Houthis could, because they're feeling rather empowered at the moment, could decide to launch a missile in the direction of Israel. All of those things together should help us refocus our attention from the Persian Gulf side, not that that's not important, but to the Red Sea side. Do you see any evidence that anybody's thinking Red Sea in the broadest sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. And I think, all of those are fair points. First of all, you have the potential for the Houthis to really gain de facto control over the Bab el-Mandeb. And that is a crucial choke point for the Red Sea and, a strategic area. It's why we have that base in Djibouti. It's why we're there. But if we are not empowering other regional partners to try to make sure that that the Houthis don't gain that control, I think we have a problem. And so by cutting our support to the Saudi-led coalition, I think it's a mistake. Look, I understand why the Biden administration is concerned. I will say that even during the Trump administration, there was concern about the way that the Saudis carried out this war. They are not the Israelis, right? The Israelis have years and years of practice in making sure that they're able to minimize civilian casualties. They have a professional military. The Saudis just don't have that. And so they've botched it time and again, but that doesn't mean that we should be giving up. We should be trying to guide them more and to help reform their military. I think we gave up too soon. And by the way, it's also interesting as we talk about rebalancing our military assets all around the world, bringing people home from so-called forever wars, getting out of the Middle East. The idea that we wouldn't be relying on our regional partners and putting more pressure on that base and the personnel in Djibouti. It's inconsistent with American foreign policy across the board, Democrat and Republican right now. So I find that all very strange. Now, the question about potential ballistic missile or other attacks against Israel, very real possibility. We have heard the Israelis talk about weapons that the Houthis have amassed, including PGMs. And I think, if memory serves, early on in the pandemic, I think I might have given a talk to the JPC on PGMs, on these precision guided munitions out of Lebanon. What we're hearing, and I was talking before about how how Yemen has become kind of a proving ground or a testing ground for Iran technology and Iranian weapons. The Israelis have actually made mention of the fact that the Houthis have acquired some of these PGMs. And, it's unclear whether these are weapons that will only be targeted at Saudi Arabia or whether they could be fired in longer distances. I don't have any clear indication of this. But again, the real concern is that weapons that are being tested and used in Yemen could be then spirited off to Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Gaza, and put Israel in the firing line. And, just to put a finer point on it, with PGMs, these are precision guided munitions that are able to hit the targets intended within about 10 yards. So extremely precise, and also have the ability to evade surface to air defenses, right? So that means that Iron Dome, David Sling, all the systems that Israel has created that have been incredibly successful over the years, they may not be effective in countering Iran supplied PGMs, the kinds that are potentially being tested in Yemen. So whether it's the Houthis that fire them or not is actually inconsequential to me. It's the question of what they're doing with those weapons and how Iran is moving them around once they've been tested, after they've been used. This is where Iran is really, I think, running the table on not only our Gulf allies, not only in the United States, but also Israel.
Thank you. We're going to take two more short questions. The first one is Jordan appears to have nixed Bibi's trip to the UAE today by denying them overflight rights of Jordan, which is very weird since they signed a new aviation accord back in October, I think, precisely so that Israel could fly over Jordan to Bahrain and that sort of thing. What is that? Is that designed against Bibi, or is that actually possibly designed Jordan against Saudi Arabia? Because there was a rumor that Bibi might be meeting some interesting Saudis.
Yeah, we heard that MBS and Bibi might have been set to meet. Look, I'll just say this, that this was apparently in response to Israel's unwillingness to allow for special security coordination on behalf of the Jordanian crown prince, who wanted to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I guess it was going to be today. The Israelis said no. And then the Jordanians said, okay, well, if you're saying no here, then we're going to say no there. What I can say more broadly about the Jordan-Israel relationship is that it is imperiled. There is no doubt about it in my mind right now. It was really the first semi-warm normalization agreement. We certainly can't really call Egypt that, and certainly can't call the Palestinians that. But the Jordan-Israel agreement was the model for many years. And the military cooperation, the intelligence cooperation, and even some of the economic ties between the two countries were very positive. What we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years has been a steady unraveling of the relationship. And as I understand it, as having talked to folks in the region, Israelis, Jordanians, as well as U.S. officials, Democrat and Republican, a lot of this just stems from a personality conflict between the king and Bibi himself, which is very, very unfortunate. I think it's been exacerbated, by the way, because of the Abraham Accords construct. Here you have Israel, to a certain extent, maybe taking for granted the relationship that it's had with Jordan over the years, looking at this kind of new shiny object over here. You got the Gulfies, you got Saudi, maybe you've got, the Emirates and Bahrain and all these other countries. And so they've kind of given short shrift to the relationship with Jordan. My understanding is that there are economic opportunities that the Israelis have foregone. And there are things that they can do to strengthen this relationship, but that Bibi doesn't want to. We don't have to get into all of them right now, but suffice it to say, these are not heavy lifts for Israel. So I think there's some blame to go around on the Israeli side. What I would also note, though, is that Jordan can't afford to lose Israel as a partner. And I think they're playing with fire. The fact that they are, kind of engaging in this brinksmanship or one-upsmanship with Israel, they're betting money that they don't have. The Israelis are the guarantors of their security at the end of the day. That I don't think that Jordan would have the kind of relative security that it has today domestically, internally, or externally, were it not for Israel. And I think, to a certain extent, both sides are taking each other for granted. And my hope, anyway, is that the Biden administration will work more on this. I know the Trump administration tried and failed, or at least didn't make the progress that it had hoped for. But I do see this as a strategic challenge moving forward, and one that wouldn't necessarily be inconsistent with some of the other goals that we've heard the Biden administration talk about already. So let's hope that they put a focus in this direction.
Okay, that's a downer.
Yeah.
We're getting to the end of our program, and regular listeners know that I do not like to end on a down question. I prefer to ask a question at the end, the answer to which is positive. And so a listener has put in the positive question for me. And that is, you mentioned the idea that the Saudis might decide just to go with the Iranians. I mean, throw in the towel and say, all right, fine, we'll figure out how to live with these people if that's what we need to do. But here's the other possibility, that falling out with the Biden administration and Saudis being nervous and everybody being nervous about Iran, could that drive the Abraham Accords people and the Saudis closer together? Could we see what President Trump tried to call a Middle Eastern NATO? Could we see them coming together?
Look, it is a very real possibility, and I would say that is a positive, and it's something that maybe I should have highlighted a little bit more, to be honest. The Saudis could decide that, forget this great power stuff, forget China, forget America. We're going to have to just deal with the neighborhood that we live in, and we're going to have to address it, with the resources that we have around us, and that would mean, relying on the other Arab states, the Sunni Arab states, or the moderate Arab states, as we often call them, but also working more closely with Israel, potentially working more closely with the Eastern Med countries as well. And so you could see that. You very much could. We sort of think about what happened last time around, and it was really the JCPOA, it was the Iran deal that drove these countries together in the first place. I always say the joke that I hear around the region that, Obama got his Nobel Prize about 5 or 6 years too soon. He should have gotten it instead of 2009. He should have got it in 2015, not because he solved the nuclear problem, but because he drove the Arab states to start working more closely with Israel. They saw that they had no other choice. That is a very real possibility here. My only problem with that construct right now is that, all of this was kind of done at least with the thinking that the U.S. would eventually come back around and gain its senses. And the fact that we're going through this JCPOA process again, the fact that this is happening on the heels of the decision to release that Khashoggi report and the delisting of the Houthis and everything else, one gets a sense, these are the Saudis at the end of the day. This is a Bedouin society with a long memory. I think they're going to feel as if their honor has been impugned. And that's my major concern here, and that they may just decide that they need to turn their backs on the kind of US-led security architecture. That's my concern. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And I think that there is still very much an opportunity for the Israelis in particular to show how they are valuable to the Saudis, to show how they can be a leader in some of these regional constructs that we've been talking about. And I do know that is what Israel's doing already. Today, I read a report in Axios by Barak Ravid, where the Israelis are pushing very hard to have a signing ceremony with Sudan at the White House to make this a more concrete peace agreement, as opposed to sort of one that was done on the fly in the fall of last year. So the Israelis are pushing hard for it. I think the Emiratis, it's becoming very clear as we're seeing some defense companies working together between the Emirates and Israel on on missile defense and air defense. So we're seeing a lot of very positive things. And my hope anyway is that the Saudis see that there is room for them there as well, and that we begin to see these actors in the region for the first time really start to take responsibility for their own security in coordination with one another. And that would be the happy ending, the John Grisham ending, if you will, to all of this. Whether it happens remains to be seen, but I think it is a very real possibility.
I take that as a plus. I take it as a great final comment. John Schanzer, thank you for being with us. To our audience, thank you for attending. And that is the end of our program for today. Thank you very much.